stand and give the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Madam Clerk, can I get a roll call, please?
Member Miklish?
Yes.
Member Hurley?
Yes.
Member Young? Here. Vice Chair Hawkinsmith? Here. Chair Lowry?
Yes.
We have a quorum.
Okay, I guess the first thing we have here is the approval of the agenda. Everybody had an opportunity to look at today's agenda?
Yes.
Any motions on that?
Chair, if we are adding one staff presentation, I don't know what to call it or where to put it. Brandon, you want to do it in the beginning?
Okay.
It's about the new Senate bill that came out and how it could potentially affect all the work that you've all been doing with the overlay rewrite. So,
Okay.
not the best news, but
Is that going to be presented by yours truly? or so?
yeah, and there's a few slides that we're going to show you.
Excellent.
So we can do it after the action item, since they're in attendance. So I would just say maybe 5B.
Okay. With that being added, any motions on the agenda?
And then just one announcement at the end for
Okay.
the museum event. That's all.
So we'll make that 5C.
Motion to approve the agenda with changes.
Second?
Roll call, please.
Member Hurley?
Yes.
Member Young?
Yes.
Vice Chair Hawkinsmith?
Yes.
Member Miklish?
Yes.
Chair Lowry?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Okay, this is the time for audience comments. You can make comments now if you'd like, or if you're here for a specific action item, you can wait and make comments at that point. So with that being said, does anybody have any comments they'd like to make at this time? Okay, with that, with no one responding to that, I'd move to the approval of the minutes. I was not here last month, so I can't be involved in that. Has anybody read it, and do they have a motion?
I motion to approve the minutes from the regular meeting on July 6th.
Second.
Roll call, please.
Member Young?
Yes.
Vice Chair Hawkinsmith?
Yes.
Member Miklish?
Yes.
Member Hurley?
Yes.
Chair Lowry?
Yes,
Motion carries.
if I can vote. I wasn't here. Okay, next we go to the action items. Action items 4A, certificate of appropriateness on case number 23054 regarding a property at 104 23rd Avenue in St. Pete Beach. Ms. Rossetti, do you have a presentation? Hi.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody.
Aye.
Get the PowerPoint up. This is a certificate of appropriateness at 104 23rd Avenue. It's case number 23054. The applicant is Carla and Howard Paul Markowitz, and the request is for a certificate of appropriateness for this contributing structure in Paso Grill to add a fabric awning or with a shade canopy over the existing front entry area in a manner that meets the CLG appropriateness standards for the Paso Grill Overlay District. We will show you a zoning map, an aerial photograph of 104 23rd Avenue, and then the staff findings and recommendation. So the property is zoned RU2, residential urban, and it is located within the PAG Overlay District. This is an aerial shot of the house, and you can see the front of it. Right now it's currently plain and it does not have any sort of awning over the front entry area. The highlighted area shows what this canopy would cover. These are photos from the 2015 Florida Master Site File Record, and at that time there was a picket fence that kind of encompassed the porch area. That picket fence area has been removed. This is what it looks like today. You can also see shutters at some point were added. I know we did not process a COA for those shutters on the right and on the left. They do exist and were properly permitted. So, you know, I'm not sure how they were there, but they're there. And the awning itself is proposed to go over the front of the building, and that would be the extent of it. I also have, before moving on, a sample of what the awning material looks like. So as you can see, the awnings on the right and on the left of the entry area are black. And this is what the awning would look like. So it's black and gray, and it would blend in with the house. I thank the applicant for this, because usually they don't give us samples of what they're proposing. Oops. So we've gone over the certificate of appropriateness criteria before. It needs to meet the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation, or it has been amended. And we do keep a copy of these standards in office and refer to them as we review certificates of appropriateness. So the property has been used for its historic purpose. It is a residential structure, and this staff believes is a minimal change to the defining characteristics of the building, especially because this awning is going to be attached by a frame, a metal frame, and it's a removable structure. So it's really not permanent. It's not like an enclosure is being proposed to be constructed. It's an awning, a shade awning. Also, we believe the physical historic character of the property will be retained and preserved, and this property is recognized as a physical record of its time, place, and use within the district. There are just, the property itself has some distinctive features and finishes, but it is pretty much a utilitarian or typical type of property within the Paso Grill Historic District. The use of awning material and covers and the like are pretty typical in and around Paso Grill for shade purposes and protection from rain and other elements. There would be no surface cleaning of the structure undertaken, and I do not believe that there are any significant archaeological resources that could be affected by this project, as nothing is going to be dug in the ground. It's just going to be attached to the existing building. And it will not destroy any historic materials that characterize the property. Staff is recommending approval of the requested certificate of appropriateness for this contributing property in Paso Grill to add a fabric awning, shade canopy, and metal frame over the front entry area in a manner that meets the COA standards of the Paso Grill Overlay District as shown in the application and as shown on the survey that was used as a site plan. Staff is recommending approval, and this would be our recommendation for action. Thank you. I'll be glad to answer any questions if you've got them.
I have a question. If you can go back a couple screens for that. Yeah, right there. No, next, go back. Yeah, that one, that last one.
This one?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
And here's my question. I mean, this seems to me to be a fairly insignificant thing, which is fine. I'm glad they brought it to us. And
It is minor, yes.
Yes. But is there a standard of some sort? I mean, I know it says requires minimal change to the defining characteristics. Would this be like a gray area thing where, like a moment ago, you mentioned at some point they had put shutters up, and I'm okay with that. I'm just saying, but where is the defining line, if there is one, where someone needs to come to us as opposed to just going ahead and do it?
I don't think that we necessarily have that specific a standard.
Right.
If something is going to be attached to the house, it should be coming forward for a COA. In this case, these things are removable, and the house can go back to looking exactly how it had looked previously. They are minor, but they still need to come to you for review. The application fee is very minor, and it's really for the board to take a look at and make a determination if what the awning is, for example, if the awning is appropriate, if the color of the awning is appropriate.
Essentially, we get to define what minimal change means too, for that matter.
Because it's not that specific in the code,
Right.
correct? And it's,
more for future cases, I'm just trying to get an idea of where the line exists if there is.
we don't see that many temporary additions,
Right.
but it was felt that this does have an effect on the appearance of the exterior of the front, so it was brought to you.
Okay.
Maybe it would be of benefit in the future, and certainly open to your interpretation, of having it maybe more defined. I don't know if that would make it any easier for you or for us, but maybe if we would be able to say what are minimal improvements or minimal, characteristics.
We could get into that. We could
I know that's a
define
can
that,
of
and that would
worms.
involve more than likely a changing of the code, perhaps.
Well,
I'll
and
refer
these
to
are,
Matthew.
if I may, I appreciate that, Ms. Rossetti. These are standards that are outside of our code.
Right. And so those.
So we can't, I guess technically we could develop standards that are somewhat of, more strict. But if they don't define it, then we should,
so
then we shouldn't define
The
it.
Department of Interior says minimal change is the words they want to use, and they don't want to define it any further, which is fine.
And I'd have to look into it, to be honest.
I guess.
Because there may be a definition there that I just haven't seen.
Yeah, and I'm just wondering from the standpoint, let's say these folks decide just to put it up and didn't go through it this way, what would the city do? Would we even know about it? Where's the,
That's a good point.
so.
If we did know about it, though,
Well, I appreciate the fact they brought it in, and that's great, and I'm not jumping ahead to what I think the board's gonna do here, but, this is a fairly minimal thing, and I hate to see people with good intentions having to slow down what they wanna do to come in front of us and that kind of thing, I guess is what I'm saying. But I guess we can just deal with that.
well, and I think the
when and if it
way,
comes up.
if I may, the way it's set up is if you have a historical structure,
Right.
what the city wants is you to ask us before you do anything, right? And if, as long as you ask us, then at least we can make a determination on whether or not we feel like this is appropriate for a COA.
Okay.
It's the people doing things without this, and then we'll have to take them to code enforcement and, handle it that way.
After the fact. So to confirm, this is a contributing structure, but
This is a
not,
contributing
not a
structure.
designated structure?
That's correct.
Okay. Would it qualify as a designated structure?
We would have to take a look. We'd have to research a little bit and see.
Well, I'm sure it's old enough,
Yeah.
I would say.
Yeah.
It's over
Well, it would
50
be-
years old?
Yeah, well, that makes it contributing, but,
Yeah.
as to whether or not they wanted to move forward at some point for local designation,
If they wanted,
outside of this process, obviously, so.
if they wanted to move forward with local designation, they would make application, and then staff would assess it, write a report, and bring it to you.
Well, we have a really cool plaque.
We
That's
do.
right.
We do that.
That's right.
Just saying.
Actually, do we have them now?
We said,
Well, we really have a really good plaque idea.
We're using them for people when they do the orders, yes.
Okay.
But I don't physically have them sitting on my desk. It's by order.
And Lynn, I have a couple questions when you, are those Bahama shutters on either side of the door? My picture is kind of fuzzy. It's an awning of some kind, and I'm thinking it's a Bahama shutter.
I'm not that good with what shutter is what type.
Well, a Bahama shutter looks like a shutter, but it's flat like this and it lays again. Instead of
It
folding, it folds up and down.
It looks to me like it folds up and down, but the property owner is here, and I believe that she would be well able to answer your question on.
And the other, well, one of them definitely looks like a Bahama shutter. I can't tell on the other. And these are black, the ones that are,
Yes.
okay. And is there any kind of structure over the door now, the front door? Because it seems to me you would need something over the door for the
Actually,
elements. I don't know.
no, you don't. I don't believe that you do. But the property owner wants that over their door. And if this is approved, like say in 5 years, they decided they didn't like this and wanted to go to straight black or maybe straight gray, or something like that. They repaint the house and want to match. I wouldn't, once the structure, that frame is up, I would think that if they wanted to change the color out, that would not be something that we would typically bring to you. Because the actual shade structure would have already been approved.
Right, because I don't want to be in the business of telling people what color their houses have to be.
We're going to be decorators now.
Maybe one or two houses, but no.
The ones on either
Right,
side.
okay, that makes sense, that's good.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, does property owner, anybody wish to speak about this? And could you just give us your name and your address for the record?
Afternoon, Board. My name is Carla Markowitz. I'm the homeowner at 104 23rd Avenue, and I'm seeking to have this awning installed for everything that you said, to have some shade and also protection from the rain. We can't even get in the door without getting poured on. There is absolutely nothing there to protect that. So that it would do the elements also, but also the shade on that in the whole front of the house, and I'm hoping that would help with keeping the house cooler as well. Because there's windows there in the front, of course, as well as the glass door, that it would help shade.
You want to ask your questions about Bahama shutters?
Oh, those are Bahama shutters.
Bahama shutters on either
Bahama
side,
shutters,
and they're
yes,
black?
They're not black, they're charcoal gray.
Okay.
And so it does coordinate with, with the stripe, because the white is a little gray. I don't know if you noticed on the stripe. It's not pure white. It's a
It
little-
kind of looks green, like a hunter green on my photographs. Maybe it's just.
Oh, no, ma'am, it's,
So I would just,
yeah.
so those colors blend perfectly with that. Yep.
I think so, thank you.
Does anyone have any questions?
I do not.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Can I make a motion?
You sure can.
I would like to move to approve case 23054 as submitted.
I'll second.
Roll call, please.
Vice Chair Hawkinsmith,
Yes.
Member Miklish,
Yes.
Member Hurley,
Yes.
Member Young,
Yes.
Chair Lowry.
Yes.
Motion carries.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, now we're to presentations. 5, which is a Certified Local Government Annual Workshop. So I'll turn it over to staff. Brandon, how you doing?
Hey, how's it going?
Good.
So we just wanted to give you a quick legislative update on one particular item. If we could get the PowerPoint pulled up, please.
Brandon, before you start, Lynn, are you handling the annual requirement for the workshop?
Yes.
Okay, because I think that's first, Brandon.
It's your.
On the slide?
Brandon's talking about is included, it's embedded in the PowerPoint.
Okay.
If you want-
I just wanted to make that, so that we're, essentially 5B and 5A will be
Okay.
kind of a joint discussion.
Yeah,
Sorry, Brandon. Thank you.
just to start with that, as a certified local government, we have a requirement that at least once a year we have a workshop. It's not structured a specific way, it's just bringing information to you. We hope to have them more than once a year, but this is a month that we didn't have much on the agenda, so I know Lynn has some more historic board-focused items. We just wanted to give a legislative update to start out. So this has been a really active legislative session as it relates to things that relate directly to planning and zoning, a lot to deal with property rights. And one of the most impactful bills that affected us, and this has been signed, it's actually retroactive to September of last year, is Senate Bill 250 titled Natural Emergencies. This was signed by the governor on June 28th. Again, it applies retroactively to the landfall of Hurricane Ian last year. It applies to any municipality within 100 miles of the impact site of Hurricane Ian or Nicole. We're about 80 miles northwest of Cayo Costa, which is where Ian made landfall. So what this bill does is until October of next year, any municipality within 100 miles cannot raise building inspection fees. We cannot propose or adopt a moratorium on construction or redevelopment of any property damaged by either hurricane. It doesn't deal with anything to do with actual development rights. The code standards do still apply, but there can't be a moratorium on reconstruction of a property if it's been damaged by either of those hurricanes. The city can't propose or adopt more restrictive or burdensome amendments to its comprehensive plan or land development regulations, nor can it propose or adopt more restrictive or burdensome procedures concerning review, approval, or issuance of a site plan, development permit, or development order. And development orders are the things that are issued after variances, after certificates of appropriateness, conditional uses, and so on. There are some exemptions. Those amendments can be proposed if they're privately initiated by the property owner affected by the amendment. So if someone decided we're willingly going to restrict our property, that is something that could be proposed and initiated prior to October of next year. But otherwise, these items are retroactive to September 28th. And this is fairly unusual. Any adopted, restricted, or burdensome amendment is immediately nullified or voided. There are a few other provisions that relate to just zoning and planning in the city generally. The city cannot prohibit temporary structures. These are things like RVs, trailers, etc., for 36 months following a natural emergency or until a new home is CO'd. This does require water or electric connections, and it does need to be the resident's primary home. It also increases the time frame to exercise development rights from 6 to 24 months following a state of emergency. We do have some open major developments here, Quarry Landings being one of them. As this Senate bill has taken effect, it's been signed into law that has extended the rights for anyone who has received a development order that was open at the time Ian made landfall to actually exercise and undertake those rights. Typically, it's a 1-year time frame. They've had another 24 months tacked onto that, barring any or pending any future emergency orders that may be put into place. So that's just an overview of the bill. I believe the Assistant City Attorney has more details on how it might affect us.
Thank you, Brandon. So to echo what Brandon said, it was a very busy session this year. There's also some other bills that affect ordinance adoptions and things that are going to affect as early as October. So we're all trying to scramble. I'm part of a city attorney email chain. No one really knows how to deal with this one specifically. Luckily, we're not in the group of cities that actually passed more restrictive regulations since September, so there's nothing that we've been doing that now we have to go back on. But when it comes to the overlay, if we think about what the board is trying to do, which is require every property owner to build to a new standard that we're creating, with no definition in the statute of what burdensome and more restrictive is, it's just something to keep in mind, right? I mean, we're still going to have Tara come here. We're still going to work on what we can. But the language, if we can go back a slide, Brandon, it doesn't just say adopt, it says propose, right? So in my opinion, propose would be in final format at some kind of city commission hearing. Now, I'm not saying no, but I'm not saying yes either. And I just wanted you all to be aware, because I know we've spent a lot of time and discussion going through what we're doing, and we're going to continue to move forward with the understanding that we may not be able to actually adopt anything until October of next year.
That's pretty quick for us. I have some questions about this.
I do too.
Yeah, you want to go?
Sure. Can we see the page after this one? So I have a question. So within 100 miles, even though, we'll take St. Pete Beach as an example, that we didn't take a direct hit. So is what this is saying that if we are within 100 miles of where the hurricane hit or the disaster area, even in St. Pete Beach could not prohibit RVs, people from living in RVs, or
So
they get extra time to develop property, even if there was no damage?
So this one, in my opinion, the way I read this, because as you know, our main office is in Naples, and I mean, we got hit a lot harder than St. Pete Beach, specifically Fort Myers Beach, right? That's where I think that comes into play, because they're still dealing with it now. Like if you drive through Fort Myers Beach, there's RVs on lots with their houses knocked down while they build up. So I don't think this is something that will come into play here.
Okay.
Right.
Well, I mean, that makes sense, that where it's affected and people don't have places to live now.
And it says
But we're
here,
saying this
until the new
encompasses
home
100
certificate of occupancy, so it doesn't mean that, you know, Uncle Joe can park his RV in your front yard and live there until his home's ready in Fort Myers.
Yeah, and it would have to be on the side of the property, and I have not been told or heard of any property in the city that received damage to the point that they are rebuilding.
That was a question I was going to have.
Right, so I don't know if this essentially will be applicable here in our city, right? Because I don't think anyone abstained so much damage
Right.
that they have to rebuild their home.
But it doesn't really,
Well,
I mean, we're talking about with a 100-mile radius, it's basically, it's a net. And it's just, are we talking about places that actually got damaged? Or is this sort of a blanket thing that, oh, if you live within 100 miles of where there was an actual touchdown, then if you want to live in an RV in your driveway, you can?
Well, and I think to answer your question, I think you would have had to been affected by the natural emergency. That's my initial take, right? With the understanding that no city attorney has really interpreted this yet. There's going to be someone that's going to do it, number one, and then everyone else is going to follow. But I also see this as something coming into hurricane season now, right, that you have to be aware of. If we get hit, which I hope we don't, and there are substantial damage to homes, you may hear a lot of generators for the next, I don't know, 30 months while they...
I always hear them.
Well, I mean, we have a lot of generators in the city anyways, but you know what I mean. There may be people who need to live in an RV on their property. Because the issue that was happening statewide is a lot of people have regulations on what you can put on your single family lot. RVs, livable RVs not being one of them. Some cities allow for your storage and things like that. So this was directed to that. It was, hey, allow people to live in their RVs while they're building up their home.
In an uninhabitable home.
Correct.
But that's not what this says.
Well, it does, because you have to, if it's uninhabitable, I'm assuming that you wouldn't have a CO.
Yeah, it says or until new home certificate of occupancy.
You have 36 months to build a
and to be the resident's primary home. So,
Well, following a natural emergency or until a new home CO.
Yes,
And it must be your primary.
Where you can
Right.
move into your house.
And it must be your primary home, right? So to me, that means homestead. So if you ever homestead here, or if you ever homestead in Fort Myers or somewhere else, you can't just put an RV on your property here and live in it while your home in Fort Myers is, right? It has to be on your primary residence. That would have had to be affected by a natural emergency.
Question I would have, which has more potentially to do with what we're contemplating, okay? Because it clearly, the spirit of this should be, you can't restrict people from fixing their damaged homes. You can't change things that's going to restrict them from, what they could have done. Now their house is damaged and they still need to be able to do it. What bothers me, if you go back one, please, Brandon, subparagraph 2 talks about damage by either hurricane. Then 3 and 4, they don't mention damage, right? I'm sure you figured that out. And that's a problem. So I don't know if you probably have, but go into the legislative intent papers of this stuff. I wonder if they talk about that a lot more, whether this really is supposed to be designed for damaged properties. And because, I mean, they're not going to, when they pass a bill like this, they're not going to nitpick and say this place, this place, this place, this place. They're just going to say 100 miles because it's an easy thing to say. But my question would be ultimately, considering really doesn't have any damage in this area, and did we ever under a state of emergency in St. Pete Beach?
In Pinellas County, we were.
We were, okay. Well, that qualifies.
Well, and it started off as 80 miles, which would have missed us.
But my point being
And they changed it to 100.
is I would think it'd be against the spirit of what this is to suggest that, for example, developers could come in and do something because they've got a delay of, you can't change any rules for another year. And I think that's what we're concerned about, that if we say in our code we want to change it and restrict a little bit more, we'd be in violation of this. And I'm just saying, I think again, just talking about reading this, this should have been designed to be for damaged property and shouldn't be, I think, an excuse for, developers to have a free-for-all, so it'll be interesting to see how it all gets resolved. And I appreciate what you said about how we're going to go forward with this.
I don't think it's going to be interpreted the way that you're saying.
Probably not.
I have a feel, like, just reading it for the plain language of the statute, there's a reason that they didn't include damage by either hurricane in subparagraph 3 and 4.
Well,
And I think that reason was, mind you, we have regulations now, right? So everyone still has to comply with what's currently in the code. But if we create even something simple like a different permit process,
right.
or an approval process, or we're adding a wrinkle to how we approve site plans, I could not opine to do that in any regard.
Well, that's why I wondered if you've pulled, I can't think of what they call it, the legislative intent, but the background, only because having done practice law for a long time, I do know that many of the bills that are passed are not very well thought through. It's just a matter of them not thinking about something. Like someone said, oh yeah, we should have said damage in 3 and 4. It's clearly what we meant. I understand that, that remains to be seen, but it's almost counterintuitive to say we're gonna file SB 250 to protect damaged homes, but we're gonna let it have another effect which allows essentially people to, the city to not go on with business when we don't have damaged property. So, but I'm just saying that from the standpoint that I also appreciate what you said, that we'll just keep moving forward as we are, because I think some of the things, just since we mentioned it, ultimately what we do may not affect,
It depends. I mean,
if we make everything
we're
under an
gonna
overlay.
easily have, unless you guys want to be here for like 8 hours, one meeting. I mean, I can definitely see at least a handful. I mean, you're talking a very comprehensive overview of what Tara did and a lot of changes.
Okay, well, we haven't seen it, so, all right.
Well, and all I'm saying is that may already put us at November, December, until we have the direction from you, like, okay, we're good,
All right.
right? And then we have to put something together, so the timing may, but you have to keep in mind, there's another session coming up, this could be extended. I mean, we don't know where this is gonna go, essentially. We could always make tweaks. I mean, there are gonna be things that we can change in the overlay, right?
Right.
I just wanted you all to be aware that there may be some things that we can't touch for now,
Okay,
because there would be no point.
I came across something quite by accident today. September of last year, we were discussing the CRDEA, which is part of what Tara's working with, I believe, which would fall under this proposed changes thing.
right.
Which
So-
means that the free-for-all on 8th Avenue can continue on.
Potentially. And discussing it and proposing it are two different things, right? Me proposing it is in the form of legislation, so I still think we can talk about it, but we're just gonna have to adapt. Like I said, luckily from our department, we didn't approve anything since September, so there's not that we have to like undo permits that were issued now, and there's other jurisdictions that completely revamped how you lot split and how you do all of this, and they actually approved applicants that way, and now everything's void. So I mean, I don't envy them in any way. But yeah, I try to, it's not the best news.
Well, when you
what we're
say
doing.
everything's void a minute ago, none of that's been litigated yet, though, I assume.
No.
Not in our area, I know
No,
that,
no,
but
no,
I mean, in other areas.
I'm tracking, the one that comes to mind to me is, because I was representing private clients, City of Naples did way too much. Like, we're talking 4 or 5 things. And I knew, I was just like, you guys are doing too much after the hurricane, and now they have to unravel. All of those are just void immediately the moment this was signed. And they processed applications. So that will probably end up, I could see that going to
They
court.
process applications under stricter guidelines?
Correct. Since September. The hurricane hit and they just went boom, 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 like 6 meetings in a row. New land development regulations, new approval for site plans, new approval of this, which all is now void the moment this went into law, which was July 1st. Retroactive too. You rarely see laws that are retroactive in date. So yeah, this was a shock. I'll continue to update you guys as
Okay.
as I get information, but it's kind of ironic, you know, every city's being told to go to their city attorney for this, but then all the city attorneys are kind of scrambling to understand what's going on because there's no definitions. We don't really know what the effect is yet, but you can assume that from now until October 2024, there's going to be an ordinance that a city somewhere passes that ends up in court that is either going to be deemed valid or invalid based on this statute. I just don't want to be that city. Respectfully.
Okay. Thank you.
No problem.
All right, where are we, that was B. C, yes, hi.
Continuing with the-
More review, yes. Not even more review. Hi, Lynn.
Can never get too much Lynn,
Yes.
is what he meant to say.
Sorry.
You can tell Bill's been on
Right,
vacation.
so
Yes.
moving on, and you know, I was going to bring up this about the workshops. You know, before last year, we used to have regular workshops, but last year when we were going over the CRDEA area and everything, we did a little bit of workshop, but we're getting back on track now because we used to give you guys a lot of training workshops. We're going to try and get back to that. That said, we have two areas that we want to talk about today. The first one is archaeological findings and issues. And I know when we do like an application for a COA, there's a little caveat in there that, you know, if you find anything archaeological, you know, you're supposed to stop if you're digging and, you know, come tell us. But by and large, that's about it on archaeological findings. And you know, I've heard some people say, well, you know, this is just a sand barrier island. And I don't mean any of you guys, but just people in general. This is a sand barrier island, what could be out here? And we're going to talk about that. So an archaeological site means an individual historic resource recognized for his prehistory or historic artifacts and features. This comes right out of your code. An historic resource means any prehistoric or historic district site building structure that includes archaeological value. And historic resources may include things such as Native American habitats, ceremonial sites, abandoned settlements, sunken or abandoned ships, engineering works, or other objects with intrinsic historical or archaeological value, or any part thereof, relating to the history, government, culture of the city, county, or state, and that can include the prehistory of it. Archaeological findings fall into two major groupings. The first one is human remains and/or associated burial artifacts. That's covered under Florida Statute 872, which makes it illegal to willfully or knowingly disturb human remains. Under these provisions, the state archaeologist may take jurisdiction over and control of human remains from individuals who have been dead for at least 75 years. And then pottery or miscellaneous artifacts. These are historic resource materials included but not limited to shell tools, aboriginal or historic pottery, historic glass, historic bottles, bone tools, historic building foundations, shell mounds, shell middens, and the like. So, by law, artifacts recovered from the federal or state lands belong to the public and must be taken care of on behalf of all of the citizens. Artifacts on private land are the property of landowners. However, that does not include anything dealing with human remains or human remain artifacts. Under American common law, an artifact found on or beneath the surface of your property is considered part of the real estate. This is true for an arrowhead resting on the surface of a plowed field, pottery, or Civil War cannonball found underneath a foot of soil. And if it's on your property, it's yours to keep. So the question here is there a likelihood of Paso Grill containing archaeological findings? And I did some research on that and would say that the answer is yes. I did some research, did some digging. I did put together.
Unintended.
Yes.
No pun.
Unfortunately for you guys, my my major emphasis in my master's degree was settlement geography, so I love early history and that kind of stuff. I'm going to go through some things dealing with the early prehistory and history of Tampa Bay. I also made extra copies of this if any of you would just like to have that to throw into your historic file. But originally, the basin that is now Tampa Bay formed between 15 and 7 million years ago, when the underlying limestone was deformed by collapses. This was explained by Professor Al Hine, who works with the University of South Florida College of Marine Science, and he's a geological oceanographer. Tampa Bay consists of ancient sub-basins that have formed or deformed into sinks, folds, what they call sags and warps. I'm not sure what sags and warps are, but I can look into that if you want me to. Later, was filled in by sand sediments. According to geologists, Tampa Bay itself formed approximately 6,000 years ago as a brackish, drowned river valley type estuary with a wide mouth connecting it to the Gulf of Mexico. Prior to that time, it was a large freshwater lake, possibly fed by the Florida aquifer through natural springs. This prehistorik Tampa Bay area was inhabited by Paleo-Indian cultures during the Tampa Bay early geologic history. Around 2000 BC, Egmont Key formed in the mouth of Tampa Bay, and ancestors of the Seminole Indian tribe began using it as a fishing location. Around 900 AD, multiple city centers were formed on Tampa Bay, which were inhabited by the Tokobega, Yuzitsa, and the Masoko peoples, who were the ancestors of the modern-day Seminole people. In 1528, Spanish explorer Panfilo de Narvaez wrote about his exploration of the New World and included descriptions of Egmont Key and the area's barrier islands. De Narvaez included a description of his mainland landfall at 1700 Park Street, which is now called the Jungle Prada site, and is preserved as part of St. Petersburg's park system. The site features Tokobega mounds and abuts Bocasiega Bay. There are a number of these types of mounds up and down Bocasiega Bay, from Maximo all the way south to Mexico, where that was originally a fish camp. But before it was a fish camp from settlers, it had been inhabited by the Seminole Indians, and even earlier. There are mounds all over Pinellas County. Pinellas County was basically, years ago, a beehive of Seminole Indian and earlier activity. And the barrier islands were not necessarily inhabited as much as they were utilized as areas to go fishing from. And that's where in a minute we're going to get to Paso Grill being, possibly an area where we would find artifacts because of the fresh water artesian well that people have called it, but that was south of the 8th Avenue Business District. And we also have some early photographs that show a water body there, and that was fresh water. And most barrier islands did not have fresh water. And so if you think about it, those Paleo-Indians and others who were utilizing, maybe the Egmont Key area or Mullet Key area. We also have, it's just a Mullet Key, Bocasiega Bay. You have a number of different keys and islands that have artifacts on them. People have found some artifacts, but because of the fresh water, that would have been an attractor. And the more people you have coming to a place, the more likelihood there is of artifacts. So especially in the southern part of Paso Grill, I would think that there would be a fair likelihood of artifacts. Some of you who were on the board at the time, early when I came here, I think it was in January of 2020, we had a case before the board for certificate of appropriateness and a FEMA variance. And our statement in the COA that says that they need to let us know if they found architects. Well, they interpret that to mean that when they came to the meeting to, hear their case and discuss it, they happened to show us some artifacts that they had just found. And they were pottery and things like that, so it wasn't anything that wouldn't have been theirs. But, you know, there are definitely things that would, I'm sure, be found when people do start digging around, especially in the southern part of Paso Grill.
And that was from the little house they call the Nugget, right?
Uh-huh.
They found some pottery under there.
So, I mean, this is where I was going. I was forgetting all of them, but Egmont, Mullet, Fort DeSoto Park, you know, is part of Mullet Key. And they have a, you know, Mullet Key actually is made up of several keys. Long Key, that's us. Point Pinellas and Boca Ciega Bay, those were all areas that had a lot of Indian activity, and later, and prehistoric Indian activity, and also Spanish activity, and Civil War activity, Spanish-American War activity. So you can see that, I mean, it's possible that people could find remnants even of, you know, some of the war through a cannonball or artillery stuff or, you know, musket shots, things like that, that might be buried in the sand someplace. So, you know, we would maybe want to, what we're talking about actually here is possibly discussing how we might want to better protect and codify archaeological resources that might be found when people do maybe some work on their property where they're digging. And, you know, that might be something that we want to discuss in the future to say, other than just notifying us, how would we want to look at this? This is an example of a Sarasota Code of Ordinances. They discuss the following requirements apply to all building construction or alteration or land alteration activities. 1, if evidence of the existence of historic resources is discovered or observed at the development sites or during development activities after final approval, a work shall cease in the area of effect as determined by the director. The developer, owner, contractor, or agent thereof shall notify the Director of Historical Resources within 2 working days. Examples of such evidence may include whole or fragmentary stone tools, shell tools, aboriginal or historic pottery, historic glass, historic bottles, bone tools, historic building foundations, shell mounds, shell middens, or sand mounds. The director shall assess the significance of the finds within 3 working days of notification and to mitigate any adverse effects so as to minimize delays to development activities. Number 2, if any historical skeletal remains or associated burial artifacts are discovered at development sites or during development activity, all work in the area must cease, and the permittee must immediately notify the nearest law enforcement office and notify the Director of Historical Resources within 2 working days, according to Florida Statute Chapter 872. It's unlawful to disturb, vandalize, or damage a human burial. Okay, so in actuality, that could even apply all over St. Pete Beach if some of these things are found. I think probably the city attorney may or may not have something to say about this. We did discuss this to begin with when we were talking about it a few weeks ago. And, you know, we wanted to show you an example of what another certified local government does in their effort to manage it. But Sarasota and their prehistory is not a whole lot different from our prehistory. Would you like me to go on, or?
What, do we
No,
have,
that's-
is there a Director of Historical Resources or whatever? Do we have
That's
something?
in Sarasota.
Yeah, I understand that. We don't have.
We don't have one, no.
No, we don't. It would have to be somebody so
I
named.
think we did, right, okay.
Where I get most of my historical information is the museum. They have a pretty good job. I think really the question is, does the board think this is, I don't want to say relevant, but I mean, do you think we should beef up some of these definitions in the code? I think Lynn did a really good job of showing you what other governments have done in the past. I personally have never heard of something like this happening, not saying it hasn't happened. The problem with not having much in your code is if it does happen, then what? Right? So this is more of a foresight, forward thinking.
Well, I assume there is something in some of our codes somewhere that talk about finding something that they have to notify and delay digging. I mean, that's just, I think,
It's in the historic, chapter 28 of the historic preservation.
no, I'm even
code.
talking about, you know, if the city's digging a street not in Pass a Grill and they come across, you know, human remains, they got to.
That's covered by state law. That's
Okay.
completely covered by state law.
My next question is, does state law affect anything other than human remains? Does it affect, you know, if you come across a,
No, it does not.
you know, a Roman coin?
Well, I mean, for historic purposes, sorry.
We had that World War II torpedo on the beach down by the Don, like 5 or 6 years
That's kind of
ago.
what we're,
Well-
or if you uncover someone that for all you know, died in 1880, maybe you want to make that a historic site of some sort.
No, I get all, what I'm saying is this, is it's notice to the people, the property owners, okay? I mean, for example, the house that found a little bit of ceramic, they didn't, you know, they brought it in because they wanted to bring it in, they volunteered it, they don't really have to. There's nothing that seems to be in the code that says, if you find something, you must do this, or you're in some sort of violation. You know, there's the old olive jar down at the Historic Museum that was found that's probably 200 or 300 years old, and I'm sure that was just somebody who found it and decided, hey, this is cool, I'll bring it down to the museum. And so, you know, I think the question is, is it a matter of putting the public on notice that they have an obligation to give this stuff over as opposed to just volunteer it? Because like the torpedo on the beach, I'm sure when someone found it, they went, oh my God, there's a torpedo on the beach. I better notify somebody, you know?
I agree. I think there would need to be a component of public outreach as well,
Which, yeah.
I mean, for all we know, people have found things and put it in the dumpster. I mean, you don't.
Yeah,
don't
put
know.
it on their fireplace or whatever. I mean, you
Yeah,
don't,
or
you don't
took it back
really
to
know.
Michigan or.
Yeah.
Yeah, taking it to
I
Goodwill.
don't know that it would need to be as a notice so much as just an importance of you moved here or you live here and you're doing X, Y, or Z renovation. I think it's important to have these things
Preserve.
brought to light and preserved. And
I totally agree, but the question is, how do you make somebody do it?
well, how do you make anybody do anything?
Correct.
I mean,
I put it this way, it's easier to enforce if we have a code.
right.
That's my point, right? And so, but then what does the code say, and how do you put people on notice that that's in the code?
Well,
If you're
I think if you're coming in for a building permit, if it's part of,
just
on that paperwork, yeah, would be.
hey, by the
to me,
way, you know,
easiest.
if,
Yeah.
especially if you're demoing,
Well, that's, Jennifer, that's a really good point. I mean, you could actually just add that as a,
Yeah, add
like
that
some
on.
language to the building permit.
yeah,
It was something that I hadn't thought about until Lynn
yeah.
talked to me about it. I mean, she did great research, so we wanted to bring it to the board because in my opinion, it's more, when you're uncovering these things, they're probably historical artifacts, right? And this is the historic
Yeah.
board.
Well, and I think for me too, recently is when Brass Monkey, when they had to do the work at their building to reinforce the balcony, and they started digging down, and you saw where the original seawall was. And for me, that was kind of an aha moment of, oh my gosh, you know, at one point, the seawall was all the way up here. I've lived here all my life. And so I think that that was definitely an eye-opener, you know, that maybe people hopefully will pay more attention.
When you read accounts of various municipalities' archaeological resources or their their background history, those that have done more collection of archaeological data have a lot more prehistory to talk about. When I was doing my research, I didn't find a lot of prehistory about Long Key. A little bit, but not a lot. And some of what, you know, I discussed was kind of an assumption. If basically the barrier islands along Pinellas were magnets for the Paleo-Indians to use as fishing sites, then they would have come, they would have found the best places to fish, and they probably left artifacts when they left. You know, what they were fishing with, or, you know, maybe something broke, and so they just dropped it, gets covered by sand. Someday, you know, it gets uncovered.
Yeah, I'm sure the place, I mean, this begs the question, I suppose, just because, and don't get me wrong, I'm all for the people who have the sense of community that when they found something would say, I need to let people know about this. and that's fine. We hope everybody's liked it. And if that was the case, we wouldn't need any codes, right? You know, people would just do what the right thing is. Unfortunately, that's not always the way it is. But, you know, Paso Grille's loaded with old foundations. I mean, you know, the La Plaza Hotel, which burned down 100 years ago, one of my neighbors said when their neighbor was cleaning up, doing a remodel, they found the whole area where that shamrock was. You know what I'm talking about? Which was like from an aerial view, it was like a whole mosaic, I guess, that was a big shamrock. And it's like, so now you know exactly where that was. I mean, I don't know if they notified anybody, they just busted it up and left, you know, but, you know, there was a lot of stuff that was down that's been built on over the, so I mean,
That's an interesting one. Because, I mean, your code right now talks about archaeological sites and districts. I don't know, if there's a big enough area, this may be something that you all as a board initiate as an archaeological district of some sort. I mean, but without knowing and without having a process in here on how to report it, whether that's in an ordinance or whether that's in the building permit of some sort, no one knows.
well, I think the building
They may not read what we put in there, but at least it's an extra step saying, hey, by the way, if you uncover something like this, please contact blank at the city.
I think that's an excellent idea about the building permit. I mean, especially in demolition. Especially because, you know, when we look at demolition permits, it's almost always an historic site. Doesn't mean they're built on another house. That's unlikely, but, you know.
Well, and this can be something citywide too.
Well, for sure, but considering we have to do a COA in the historic, you know, that would be certainly something that could be involved in that.
Okay.
We were really just, I mean, we don't need a motion or anything.
No, I know.
We were just looking for a consensus if this was,
Worth
we were on point, worth doing, not worth doing, should we table it and think more about it? That was the purpose of bringing it up.
Well, why don't we, since we just have started talking about, hey, why don't we table it to next month, just to see if anybody has come up with any other ideas. And perhaps at that, we could get the actual copy or the paperwork of when someone files a demolition permit, what the permit actually says. To see if it'd be,
language.
Yeah, the language, so it'd be easy to add something like that.
Okay. Does everyone else feel pretty okay with that?
Yeah, sure. I think there, you know, maybe some circumstances, like when they found the ordinance on the beach, that wasn't during a building permit, so that would fall outside of that.
I understand.
Yeah, I think
Probably
we can
doesn't happen
expand
very
upon it. I'm just saying, at a minimum, that's an easy thing that we could at least look at.
Yeah, amending the
Launching
building
point.
permit document is, we don't really need much approval there, there's no
Right.
ordinance, but it could be something bigger that we think about, because like you said, the beach, there was no demolition going there. I mean, you would think someone finding something like that would call the sheriff or something.
They did, and it blew up on the beach. It cleared the way.
Don't use the word
6 years ago,
ordinance.
wasn't it?
Don't use the word blew up either.
What
A controlled, it
It was a
did.
controlled
There's
detonation.
videos out there, yeah.
They didn't drag it up here to present.
Look what I got.
Put on our safety goggles behind the days.
Well, with all of the activity, historic activity from the 1800s that went on relating to the Seminole Indian Wars and the Spanish-American War, and then later, you know, even
We have the
the countings of
World War II barracks, which we just talked about.
exactly
right?
so, exactly so. You know, there are things that could wash up from the Gulf of Mexico. One thing I found when I did my history research was interesting, dealing with geological time. This deals with Sarasota Bay, but Sarasota Bay, and what I'm going to tell you, you know, it's going to ring true for here too. And that was approximately, Sarasota Bay was formed approximately 5,000 years ago. Over geologic time, local sea level has ranged from as much as 330 feet below to 100 feet above present levels. Just 17,000 years ago, the shoreline of the Gulf of Mexico was about 60 miles west of where it lies on Sarasota and Manatee County beaches today. So
Resiliency, it's important.
that's documented geological fact. So, you know, it's
Right.
interesting.
What happens if a hurricane uncovers archaeological, and then we can't put these provisions in place to change
Not until
things?
October 24.
Well, we already have, I mean, you all can initiate, just like you can initiate expanding the historic district.
Right.
There's just a very involved, extremely
I understand.
involved process.
And I'm just,
No, but I think that's usually when things like this are uncovered, in my opinion, when water washes away
yeah.
and then comes back at times.
Or if you demolish one of the old early settlement houses and to build a new property, that's especially in the southern half of Paso Grill or the southern half of Long Key, that you're going to be more likely to perhaps find artifacts of some kind.
Sure.
Even old foundations, things like that, that may well be buried under a few feet of sand.
Thank you, Lynn.
Very
That was very informative. For all of you watching, call in if you find anything.
You're on
Bring it
notice.
in for show and tell.
Please don't. Please don't.
All right, the next topic, demolition by neglect. I'm bringing up this topic because, when I was going through some of the case files for the past few years, I noticed most of the COAs, or many of the COAs, were not COAs to do renovation work, they were COAs to demolish. And that seems to be increasing. And what is the major excuse for wanting to do that? Very often it's the building's too deteriorated. You know, it just can't be modernized. There's all kinds of rot and everything else all over. So what is demolition by neglect? Well, it refers to the practice of allowing a building to deteriorate to the point that demolition becomes necessary or restoration becomes unreasonable. The practice has been used by property owners as a means of sidestepping historic preservation laws by providing justification for the demolition of historical buildings. In order to prevent demolition by neglect, a number of cities have adopted ordinances requiring property owners to properly maintain their historic buildings. Specifically, demolition by neglect can be considered a loophole that exists in many historic preservation regulations, including St. Pete Beach's preservation regulations, which define demolition by neglect but do not otherwise address it. We define it as being demolition by neglect means the willful abandonment of a building or structure by the owner resulting in such a state of deterioration that its self-destruction is inevitable, or where demolition of the building or structure will remove a health and safety hazard is a likely result. So again, another definition according to the Preserve Rhode Island, demolition by neglect is one of the most common and challenging issues facing historic preservation and historic district commissions across the country. If properties within historic districts are allowed to deteriorate to the point of requiring demolition, the character of and the rationale for the historic district diminishes over time. Thus, tackling demolition by neglect is crucial to the survival of historic districts. Overt lack of maintenance is one strategy used by some property owners who will hope it will lead to permission to demolish a building and reuse property it sits on, often for a different and more intense purpose. Once a historic building has suffered extraordinary neglect, owners will argue that the cost of repairing the building in its deteriorated state is prohibitive and thus creates an economic hardship. And unless the local preservation bylaw clearly defines what economic hardship is and how owners are required to prove that hardship exists, communities are left deciding on a case-by-case basis whether economic hardship is an appropriate justification for demolishing a particular historic building. And this is out of the Preserve Rhode Island. They go a little bit further. I found Preserve Rhode Island to be a good source. Demolition by neglect may also be used by some property owners to sidestep the authority of their community's preservation or historic district commission. As a building deteriorates, local officials may be forced to step in and address the public health and safety liability by ordering the demolition. of the neglected property, regardless of its status within an identified and legally regulated historic area. Property owners may also abandon their historic properties for various other reasons, including simply not having the financial wherewithal to maintain the property and thus allowing the property to fall passively into the demolition by neglect category. They do further go to talk about some tools that they have enacted to deal with this. In general, affirmative maintenance obligations within a community's local historic district bylaw ensure that, 1, the beauty and function of contributing historic resources is maintained. Property owners routinely maintain their historic properties responsibly, following guidelines established for the district. And 3, the character and context of the neighborhood or area is preserved. And so by disincentivizing owners who might otherwise intentionally allow their buildings to deteriorate, affirmative maintenance regulations can be an effective tool in a community's arsenal to minimize demolition by neglect situations. I did talk to a couple communities who do have some affirmative maintenance regulations whereby once a year, for example, for their locally designated landmarks and contributing properties within a National Register district or even a local district, they will have code enforcement do a sweep of the area or of the buildings to, take a look at them and make sure that at least from the exterior, they are being properly maintained. So this brings us to board discussion. And, I'm thinking more than the archaeology stuff, the demolition by neglect may be becoming problematic as far as numbers of houses that are being demolished because we're being told and shown through photographic evidence that they are deteriorating. They're being eaten up by termites. They have rot everywhere. Owners either haven't maintained them or the owner passed away and they've sat vacant and unused for a year or two, and now, there was a hole in the roof and now there's a lot of water damage, and now we just have to demolish it. It's going to just cost too much to try and fix it up. I think you guys have heard that over and over. So,
Well, let me start off with saying none of this means anything as long as you can get a demolition permit without a reason, which is what we have right now. All we can do is delay people 30 or 90 days. And so until, I'm sure these other jurisdictions that have this, maintenance, they probably, no one can just willy-nilly go in and say, I want to demolish my property. Our hands are tied. So we can't do any, we can't make people maintain their property. Why would they maintain it when they know they can just come in and get a demolition permit? Mm-hmm. So until that changes, this means nothing. I don't think there's any question about that. So we first have to say, we'd have to enact guidelines for the demolition permits that say we could stop people from doing a demolition permit, which means you've got to have a very, very strong historical district that allow, like Charleston or something, where they say you can't tear this house down. We aren't even close to that around here, and I don't think that's even in our dreams, as we sit around here, but we wish it was. I remember the house on 18, no,
I was thinking it was 13.
no, it was, well, we probably thinking of a different house. I'm thinking of the Spanish house that was on
That is the one I was thinking of.
16th, I think it is. No, it's on 18th. And the neighbor across the street had been complaining for 10 years, saying the guy's not taking care of it, he's just neglecting it, blah, 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 blah. And the city doesn't do anything about it. I mean, I'm not blaming them, but there's no enforcement aspect of that. And again, until we have the teeth to say you can't demolish your house, this means nothing. Unfortunately, Paso Grill, I use this term, I don't mean it because I love Paso Grill, but it was a bit of a ghetto in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and a lot of houses were chopped up and fell apart, and nobody had money to take care of them, and now here we are 50 years later, and they're in even worse shape. They're full of termites and things. I'd love to keep the houses, but that neglect started 50 years ago. Mm-hmm. And by way of example, the city doesn't really have that clean of hands about this. When let's look at the the baseball park, the concession stand is falling apart in front of our eyes for the last 30 or 40 years. And so I think, you know, there's a lot of steps we'd have to take before we could ever get to the level of enforcing someone to take care of their property. I mean, don't get me wrong, I wish we could, but you know, that's going to take a ground change on the way the city does stuff, and especially with the demolition permits.
Well, does the city not have authority to issue a codes violation notice? If it's not complied with, then they can go out and mow the lawn and put a lien on the property? And I mean, they do have the authority to do that, right?
We've done it. We've abated before.
If
The reason we need
falling in, they can put a cover over it.
we need a special magistrate authority because technically we're trespassing
Right.
in a way. But I've personally been involved in the city covering pools for safety, mowing lawns, rebuilding fences, and everything's just added up. And the problem with that is you don't get paid until the property sells.
Until the property
But
sells.
at the end of the day, at least we have a lien.
Well, the other thing that I think is different now than, let's say, 30 years ago or whatever, when a lot of houses were being neglected. Now the property is so valuable, those people who are neglecting their property have already sold it, or a lot of them have, you know what I mean? So
Well, what's
that's why
happening
we're getting
now-
so many demolitions, because the money comes in and says, I bought this knockdown. And, you know, I think in the big view, we're better off maybe trying to focus on incentives to keep old houses looking
Yes.
old,
Thank you.
either by rehabilitating them to look like they did originally, and or incentivizing totally new construction that still looks like old construction to some extent. And because I think that's really the only way we get to keep the charm of Pastor Grill as, you know, 100 years turns into 120, turns into 150. I mean, a lot of those houses were pretty much just slapped up in the very beginning because it was your beach house. Got knocked down by a storm, well, you built it back up, you know, so. I don't know, that's one man's opinion, I suppose.
And Bill, I agree with you that because of FEMA rules, we're sort of at a conflict. FEMA rules would have us, every building that sits on the dirt being knocked down and built up. So we're kind of relying on property owners to have a sense of historic preservation when they want to come before us and get waivers to restore their house. But beyond that, we don't really have a lot of teeth unless people were incentivized by having something like the Mills Act, where if they did restore their house, kept their house restored, they get some sort of break on their property taxes. Now, with that, we could pass something to say, you must maintain your house in the manner that it's supposed to be maintained in order to still receive these benefits. Other than that, FEMA would have us knock down all that. They think that would be a great thing if everything got knocked down because it was neglected and nobody would be restoring their houses. But if we could somehow be more progressive and start to offer some sort of tax incentives for people to maintain their historic homes or want to
There are tax
Instead of knocking them
there
down.
are tax incentives in place for historic preservation or restoration in the form of maybe property tax abatement on a certain value of the improvements. So those incentives do exist. I don't think a lot of people know about them or understand
I think they're
how
only
to
for like
use
10
them.
years too.
They're for 10 years,
And
yeah.
it's-
And if you do come before the board and then get a demolition permit before that 10 years is up, then
Then you
you have to pay
I think
that back.
incentivizing, considering what we just talked about with Senate bill, is a creative way of amending your code without making something more burdensome.
Well, I'm not talking about something we do in the next year.
No, but I think the incentivizing, I mean, think about it, that's kind of how the initial draft of the overlay was drafted, right? You get a little bit less setbacks, you get this, if you choose to do this, kind of trying to incentivize people to do it, I think that's a great idea.
Well,
Well,
go ahead.
oh, I was gonna say, so in San Diego, they had a tax abatement, it was called the Mills Act. If your home had to qualify, and there were certain standards, had to be built before then, had to have, whatever those standards were. Once you got this once you were in the club, so to speak, you got a 50% break on your property taxes. Now, if you took your property taxes right now and half those, you would have pretty good incentive for keeping your house up. And the people who are being told they really should tear their house down and build something else, there's no incentive there for them to not do that, because in all practicality, it's going to be better for them, you know, flood insurance, the cost of flood insurance, etc. So how do we get people to jump on board and try to maintain the historic nature of their properties other than their own pride of ownership and love of history? There is none that we have now, and I don't know how we move to something like that. That's not something that's hidden, that's out in the open. It's like you could save 50% of your property taxes if you, and it's not going to be a whole lot of houses. We don't have a whole lot of houses left. But those that decide to go that route are certainly going to be paying more in flood insurance. So is there something we can do financially for them to keep them in the program? And that would be, you know, this would be a perfect place to say you can't have demolition by neglect, even if it's passive. If you want to keep that incentive.
Would this only be in the historic district? Because, I mean, speaking from code enforcement, that's a lot of people's first option, to be honest with you, is they have so much stuff to do to come into compliance, and their land is worth so much money that they come in here and say, well, I just got approached, I'm going under contract in 14 days. Someone gives them, you know, 500, 600,000, and the house is gone, when all you really needed to do was maybe put 10 or 20 into it. So with the market too, the real estate market doesn't help, because that, I mean, I'm living it. That's people's first thought when they come in here is, let me just wipe my hands clean of this and have someone come in and demo it.
Yeah, you're not talking about people who are trying to sell their house or new buyers. You're talking about people who lived in the house for a long time.
And then just can't keep up.
Buyers and sellers. So if we had a tax abatement, then that would pass on to the new owners. So
That's a good point.
you know, someone that is a great benefit to somebody who's selling their house, but it only applies to those houses that are in the club, so to speak. So if they decide they want to sell their house or sell their property, and somebody wants to tear it down, build something new, so be it. You can't stop that, and so that benefit ends. But if somebody wants to continue to maintain or continue historic preservation, there's really nothing in it for them other than their pride of ownership.
They get a plaque.
Yeah. Well, the two things I was going to, the tax incentives as they are now, I think, I'd love to see somebody do one like, say, a house sells for $1 million, what you know, whatever it is. Because I think it's a percentage of a small percentage. You know, it's not real estate tax. It's the amount of tax that goes to the city, and which is a very small amount of that, and it's a very small amount of what goes to the city. So I think you're talking maybe incentives of a few $100s, which isn't going to motivate a lot of people anymore to go through the paperwork.
Well, and you can write off permit fee. I mean, there's a lot of things that you could write off.
Here's what they should do. We should, on these old homes, they should value the home at what it was valued at back when it was built. Okay? And then people wouldn't tear them down.
Yeah, no, that's true.
So you could say, oh, your house was built in 1922. What did you pay for property taxes in 1922? I mean, I'm kind of kidding, but you could almost do a sliding scale. The city would do it, a sliding scale where the older the house is, the cheaper the property taxes, because you have kept it in good condition. You know, and so that might say
if there's maintenance issues, please report them. We take maintenance issues all the time.
Yeah, well, that's the first line of attack, really, is people.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I was just trying to think in my head about, compared to when I first moved down there, where probably almost every other house, or sorry, third house you could probably call, and there'd be some sort of code issue. It's, you know, it's much nicer now. There's probably a few places still out there.
we can't be the only city that's dealing with this. There has to be cities that have done this before us, and thank you for this incredible presentation. So was it Rhode Island that had all of that information?
Rhode Island had a lot of information.
So do
yes.
they have codes in place? I mean, they would have to have codes in place or things in place.
I'm sure they do. I've not researched their codes. I do know that right across the bay from us in St. Petersburg, they have a program with their historic properties, the local landmarks or properties that are in the National Register. I think they have two or three National Register districts, those contributing properties in there. When they get a visit by an inspection by code enforcement once a year to make sure the property is being well maintained. And if not, they will get a citation and a certain time to fix it, or they're going to have to go to the code enforcement board.
But is that a voluntary designation that the property owner can say, I don't want it? Designated like that?
No, because it's a National Historic District. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, from a local point of view, there are places, like my understanding is in Boca Grande, you can't tear houses down.
Right.
How they get away with that, I don't say get away with it, how they've enacted that, I don't know. And I would assume they'd have a lot of support from the city, and everyone thinks alike down there on what they want to do. And that's always been a mystery to me, is how we get from what we're doing here to being like, well, Charleston, maybe you can understand, because there's huge amounts of homes and huge amount of history, and it's not a little jurisdiction like we are, where, our taxes pay for our government, such as it is, so, I don't know. I once had the Boca Grande codes and was looking through it, and it was like so vastly different than what we have. Especially when on the other side, people saying, "Oh, well, you can't tell somebody you're going to alienate that amount of property. You can't tell a property, they can't sell their house, they can't tear it down. That's a violation of, your rights as a property owner." And so apparently in Boca Grande, it's not. I don't know how they got away with it, how they did that, and how that, but apparently they did. So, I just don't know. It's a mystery.
Maybe it's taking a little bit of that and emulating what they've been able to do. And I know like Apalachicola and some of those other areas, not only in our state, but in other states, that Rhode Island, that they've been able to take things, kind of piecemeal them together, so to speak, and create something where people do take pride. They are incentivized. They do get tax credits. And then it's also the pride of, I'm not going to be the bad guy on the block coming in, buying a historic property and tearing it down to put up my whatever they decide to put up.
Well, and with some of these jurisdictions, not that we can't do anything, but your first historic preservation code wasn't enacted until 2006,
Right.
almost 50 years after the city became a city. So you have to also think that a lot of these codes may have been in place and are grandfathered in when the regulations from the state were minimal,
Right.
right, at that point.
See, I just don't see how you can tell somebody they can't knock it
Demo.
out.
I'm even shocked by that,
Yeah.
because
If that's
that
true,
seems
maybe
like a
it's
property right
alleged
to me.
story, maybe it's a voluntary thing. I just find it hard that you can't sell your property, you can't knock down your house. I just think that's inherently un-American, as much as I love history and like to be able to do that, but I don't know. But to talk about what we're talking about here, I think Matthew's got the best point of, if people are doing code enforcement issue, that's really the best way of what we have right now on the table to deal with people who are letting their homes, go fall apart. But I don't think their motivation is so they can get around demolition permit. That's my whole point. They can get a demolition permit.
No, absolutely.
Yeah. So it would just be.
It's more of how you want your city to look. Well, the problem is the statute changed, so we can't act on anonymous complaints anymore, and I can't tell you how many times people call me, and they call me on their neighbor, and they don't want to give me their name, and I can't do anything with it.
Where does that statute come from? Is that statewide?
162, yeah. It was recently passed last year. It's almost like, you're the prosecutor, right? You always have a day in court to question the person that's accusing you.
Well,
That's kind of where it came from.
I get that, except for you can certainly report crime anonymously, and the cops have to respond to that. So there's
It's
a chilling
when
effect.
I say anonymous, You can't just not give your name. You have to give your name,
Right.
essentially, right, and property address. So, which then becomes public record. So it essentially deters people.
Well,
But it puts the burden on code enforcement to initiate their own, right? Because we can still initiate, like, we can be driving around and say, oh, wow, that house looks bad, and initiate it that way.
Can you deputize a resident to be a code enforcement officer and then they're
We've thought about it.
anonymous?
We've thought about it. But then again, to residents' benefit, I mean, it's a public record, right? If you're not an actual code enforcement officer and you're working as a volunteer, your name, your phone number, your address, anything that, so if someone says, who reported this, I want their information, now all of a sudden, other residents have your information, know where you live, and, you know, sometimes there's some concern with that. But property maintenance, please, I mean,
But
please.
can't an anonymous report trigger code to go by the house?
No.
Why not?
We cannot initiate a code enforcement action based on an anonymous complaint.
I'm not talking about knocking on a door.
No, initiate.
Just
So if someone says, hey, I don't want to give you my name, but there's short-term rentals happening at this house, we can't go out and do anything about that. And see, it's almost like anonymous complaints kind of don't work in our favor anymore. Because let's say someone gives us an anonymous complaint, and for example, the code enforcement officer was already going to drive by this house on its own, but now we have a record of an anonymous complaint. Now it almost hinders our ability to enforce it on our own without a grace period of some sort, or someone giving me their name. So anyone is free to call whenever they want, but unless you're going to give me your name, just assume that we're doing the best we can to fix any violation out there. Another wonderful statue.
Yeah, that creates a chilling effect that really is counterproductive of what it's trying to achieve, I would think. So,
The state was trying to put the burden more on the city, right, to initiate its own.
well, I also get the people that are, I can't think of the term, but are, pranking somebody.
Or have a personal beef with someone?
And so that's why you want a real name to be said. But what bothers me is the idea, the disconnect between if you get an anonymous complaint, why that can just be used as a tip to do your job. I mean, hint, hint.
I just think with code enforcement, the easiest way to win an appeal is due process. So I've always advised that it's just, we're going to lose anyways if we go to court.
Right.
Anyway, those are two topics to chew on, I think, and we can talk about them later as well.
Thanks, Lynn.
Thank
It
you.
was very informative. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
Any other matters anyone would like to bring up?
I think there were some announcements.
Oh, no, we have
Yeah,
some
the only
stuff.
other thing is the Gulf Beaches Historic Museum is running a series of speaking events and informational events and walking tours. Their next event is Friday, August 11th, so a week from tomorrow at the Warren Webster Building at 3 p.m. And it's research methods and historical discoveries. So very appropriate for our topics today.
Cool.
How long do these things normally last,
I don't know, like an hour and a half.
You already want an end time?
They'll be done by happy hour. Don't worry.
That was the question. Right, okay.
The 11th, you said?
Yes.
Yeah.
You got the time.
All right, anything else?
So I'll make mine quick, and maybe this is something we
No,
can.
I'm not trying to push along, just go ahead.
No.
Oh, no, it's just maybe something we can discuss think about for the next meeting, or it's just in Pass the Girl, which is obviously one of our historic areas. We had a property, Shaners, that is recently under new ownership, and it just kind of gets your mind going as to like, okay, these are the businesses that have been in place and the go-to places that we've had forever. So what could potentially be? And so I noticed that there's some signage, neon signage, and I know that's been kind of a concern within the historic area as well. So I think if it's something we could talk about at maybe the next meeting of what businesses would we see appropriate for historic areas, or how do we ensure that we keep the historic aspect of a community maybe in line with that without getting into an area that
Yes, is it possible that you could bring the ordinances we have for signage? I assume it's citywide, it's all the same, right?
No,
No.
it's actually a hodgepodge.
33
There's
zones
30, yeah,
or
it's
some ridiculous.
literally on each side of Gulf Boulevard, they have different
Okay,
regulations.
can we?
But I will say, on the sign, presentation from Kimley Horn on
Tuesday
Tuesday.
night coming
They've
up.
been working on our sign, on an updated sign ordinance for over a year.
Okay,
So we could discuss our regulations with the understanding that they are going to significantly change in the next 4 or 5 months.
well, I guess I'm just wondering what this current status is as it would pertain to Paso Grove, the historic district, or
I can
Paso
have
Grove.
that.
Yeah.
Huh?
I can have that.
Yeah, and that way we'll at least have an idea of where we're at and where we can kind of go.
Well, in signs, we've dealt with, not to call any properties out, but we've dealt with some convenience store issues with signs before in Paso Grove through code enforcement. I didn't hear any more complaints, so I assumed it worked, but once again, we have current regulations in which you're limited to a certain amount of signs on your building.
And
Can't cover windows.
Well, that's what we'd
and-
like to, I think, as a discussion item, if we could have that so we can actually be educated on that.
And the verbiage that would be permissible on said signs.
We don't regulate content.
Yeah.
First Amendment,
Well, that's a shame.
yeah.
I'm just kidding.
Well, can't be obscene, I'm sure, so,
And then I have just one announcement. Tune in Tuesday to see your chair
Oh, yeah.
handle the resolution at the city commission meeting.
Let's go get Manscaped.
Yeah, don't forget. Don't forget.
Can you have a copy of that, that you can give me this afternoon?
Yeah, I'll send it to you right
The
after.
agenda was just finalized, so,
Okay, beautiful.
yeah.
No, I mean of the.
The sign thing?
The resolution.
Yes.
It's on the agenda.
Oh,
I'll send you the document just.
thank you, Jennifer.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Anything else? All right.
Is there anything that you want added besides the sign to next agenda?
Well, didn't we mention maybe tabling the issue
Archaeological.
about, and looking at
Yeah, yeah.
demolition
Tara coming
permits?
next time?
Yes.
And Tara should be here presenting.
Ooh,
Ooh, whoa, okay.
that'll be a
Pack
fun
a
one.
snack next month then.
You want a snack? We'll bring back this. We'll bring down the city manager's snack.
Do we have any cases next month, do you know?
We do. We have a,
Oh boy.
We'll have to schedule in a snack and a potty break.
What is it?
We do? Okay. So plan on eating dinner here.
Okay, good.
No,
Anything
it's
else?
drinks
All right.
afterwards.
We're adjourned.